So we will get started officially. I'm pleased to welcome our host, EJ Kwandibens. EJ, will you accept this tobacco as a gift to you to speak with us today?
I really can't reach it inside the little mic, so yeah, kidding.
I
Of
will be
course, of
sure to
course,
give it to you in person
of
next time
course,
I see you.
of course.
And for those who don't know, tobacco is one of the most precious gifts of Indigenous people. So it is always an honor when you do offer it to people. And so if you're ever offered tobacco, that's you're being held in very, very high regard. They're often referred to as tobacco ties and sometimes prayer bundles. And you'll see people making them and putting their intentions into them and either hanging them places or burning them, which is always a nice thing to do. All right, so now I'd like to ask Brittany Bryan to offer our land acknowledgement for today. You're on mute, Brittany.
There we go. Sorry, for some reason I couldn't unmute myself. All right. Thank you so much, Angela, for inviting me to do this. I am so honored today to be sharing with you this land acknowledgement and my personal commitment to highlight and acknowledge the experiences of Indigenous peoples of this land, past, present, and future. We acknowledge we are gathering today no matter where we are on the traditional territory of Indigenous people. I want to acknowledge the longstanding contributions of Indigenous people to what is now known as Ontario. And I want to acknowledge the history of treaty making and note that hundreds of years after they were signed, the treaties between Indigenous people and first settlers remain relevant today. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people, including those who came here as settlers, as migrant either in this generation or generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Today, we pay tribute to ancestors of those of African and Indigenous origin and descent. In the city of Toronto, we acknowledge that this is the ancestral land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee. Sorry for my pronunciation, and then Wendat, and is now considered home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As a Black Jamaican Canadian, born here and raised in the Greater Toronto area, I unfortunately was not raised with a direct tie to the Indigenous peoples here in Canada. The Indigenous experience was not addressed in my schools nor in my day-to-day life. I grew up celebrating an abundance of different cultures and acknowledging different people groups, but unfortunately, the original inhabitants of this land were rarely recognized. And I believe this is a prime example of the consistent and deliberate erasure of Indigenous cultures and experiences by our city and nation. It is very easy, or it would be very easy for me to simply use my lack of experience as an excuse to continue to live in ignorance, or to feel shame and hide from the mandate that we all share to highlight the truths and experiences and the needs of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. However, I have decided not to take this moment for granted, but instead take accountability for my lack of knowledge and take responsibility for my ongoing learning. As a Black woman living here in Canada, I believe that we both Black and Indigenous peoples share a desperate need for reformation of our justice system. One of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people here in custody over the next decade. Systemically, there has been a huge disparity in the overpolicing and incarceration of both Black and Indigenous peoples in comparison to those of non-racialized people. It is again very easy for me to be tunnel visioned in focusing on the plight of my own people in this area. However, I do pledge, as I continue to fight for justice for my people, to also give voice to the experiences of my Indigenous brothers and sisters experiencing the same systemic injustice. I believe that true change can only happen when we work together, giving voice to one another. I pledge to grow as a true ally. Thank you for the opportunity.
Excellent. Carla has put some very restrictive settings on all of us that we can't unmute ourselves. So feel that power. Thank you so much, Brittany. That was incredible. That was amazing land acknowledgement and amazing pledge. I don't think I've ever had somebody come on to a land acknowledgement and make a pledge. That's absolutely incredible and very motivating to me and to everybody on this this call. I'm sure you're getting some hearts over in the chats. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce formally EJ Kwandibens, also known as Anakakesek, who is a member of the Loon clan and is of Northern Woodland Anishinaabe, Ojibwe of the this is the one I struggle with, Wabadunga White Sand First Nation community, which is part of the Robinson Superior 1850 Treaty region located 21 hours north of Toronto. EJ has worked across many sectors, including education, correctional services, social services, child welfare, and mental health. He advocates the power of change through Indigenous cultural modalities. The values and principles guiding his Indigenous ways of knowing and being stems from intergenerational knowledge transfer. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Now, Magoa.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, I got to acknowledge, Brittany, that was a fantastic land acknowledgement. Oftentimes when we hear land acknowledgements, they just become these routine scripts. And every time we hear them, or at least I do, I tend to roll my eyes because it just becomes a script that has less meaning each time we hear it. And it almost gives a connotation that we as Indigenous people have gifted those who are non-Indigenous folks all that they come to appreciate in terms of land and the spaces that they're in, when we weren't in the position to gift anything to anyone. Right? And so when we hear land acknowledgements today, it loses meaning now. And to hear your land acknowledgement, one, was a breath of fresh air. Two, you're right, Angela, we never hear pledges. And I oftentimes ask people that when we speak to the issue of land acknowledgement, there has to be action that follows with it. Otherwise, it's just lip service. And we all know the issue of lip service is, anybody could say anything at any time to anyone, and it has no meaning unless there is action that follows with it. And so, Brittany, I want to say thank you for that wonderful acknowledgement. And I hope that other organizations and people who do and speak to the issue of land acknowledgements can use perhaps a variation of yours, because it was well written. So thank you. Yeah. So those who don't know me, my name's EJ Kwandibens, and my spiritual name is Anakakesek, and I originate from the Wabidanga First Nation, otherwise known as White Sand, which is what Angela had indicated, 21 hours northwest of the city of Toronto, literally the end of nowhere. Home of the black flies. And it's important that I speak to where I come from, because it encompasses everything that I am in terms of my language, in terms of my belief systems, in terms of everything that makes up me. The territory that I come from is situated, as we mentioned, on the Robinson Superior 1850 Treaty Territory, which is comprised of approximately 8 First Nations around Lake Nipigon and Lake Superior, more specifically Thunder Bay region. And that particular region speaks to what we believe from the traditional perspective, where Anishinaabe language has originally, where it was born, where it was first created. The original dialect of the Anishinaabe people is believed to come from a region known, a territory or community in my area called Ababaka Bay, which is on the northwest region of Lake Nipigon. And it's the old dialect. And since the old dialect was was first sounded, it traveled. The traveling of languages made its way down to upper Minnesota, into the Michigan, Southern Ontario, and so on and so forth. And so there became various different types of ways of speaking the language. And so specifically in Ontario alone, we have 76 ways of speaking the Ojibwe language, 76 ways of speaking Anishinaabe. And that makes the language very complex to learn. Our language is a verb-based, action-oriented language. It's not a noun-based language, so it's very descriptive. So there's many ways of saying something based on the description or the action of what you're trying to explain. So this is what makes the language a little bit more complicated. But I wanted to say that because it brings us to a time, and we're here to talk about the celebration of Indigenous history and Indigenous Day and all that is within this month. But in order for us to recognize and celebrate what we have in front of us, we must be able to painfully remove the Band-Aid and acknowledge the history that brought us to where we are today. And this is sometimes the conversation that many people don't wish to have, because they get consumed by the romanticization of indigeneity. It's now cool to be native, so to speak. Whereas there was a time where an Indigenous person cannot walk on the street without being charged, incarcerated, or killed. There are places in Canada that still exists in terms of loss of life. There was a time before 1965 where if you didn't have a ticket, they called it a pass, off the First Nation, then you were charged, thrown in jail, or killed. If you spoke your language in public, the same thing applied. Charged, thrown in jail, or killed. If we had more than 2 individuals off the First Nation that did not have a pass, it was considered to be an illegal congregation of Indian people. You were thrown in jail, charged, or killed. So 1965 is not that long ago. And so when we look at what had transpired prior to the present day, there have been many different, I'll just say, difficulties in time. I oftentimes reflect on my mother and my mother's generation and my grandparents' generation, much like many of you can do the same with your family, the times that they came from, the difficulties and the challenges that they experienced just for being them, whatever their history might be. Ours is no different. And, oftentimes when we look at settlers or people coming into Canada, people are coming from somewhere, right? You come from a territory that is indigenous to your people from another region, but you're coming now into a territory called Canada. And you learn and you be a part of society. And you always have that opportunity to go back to your homeland at some point, if the environment is safe enough for you to do so. Whereas Indigenous folks, we don't have that luxury. This is our homeland. And it's difficult to walk on homeland when we are oftentimes viewed as lesser than the ground that we walk on. And I say that because that is a hard truth to hear. And I oftentimes hear my non-Indigenous folks, usually, and this is not to pick on the white folk, but if I'm going to just use as an example, the white privilege that comes with having fair skin, oftentimes my friends who are non-Indigenous or white, they oftentimes can't understand this. And this is not a conversation of pointing the finger or blaming or making anybody feel disempowered. This is just getting people to understand and to shake up one's reality to know that whatever is comfortable in your own life and your own reality may not be the same for another person, right? All of you work with different people in community. with disabilities, perhaps, limitations, barriers, challenges, what have you. And it becomes that much more difficult for that individual to navigate just getting up in the morning to go through the day. As an Indigenous person, there is not one day that goes by that I and or my family members don't experience some form of racism. And that is another truth that is very hard to take in. And you'd be surprised of how much ignorance that exists, not just to Indigenous folks or the perception or view of Indigenous people, just how much ignorance there is in society, period. And that just speaks to how there is so much work to be done to educate people, right? When we look at, for example, the celebration of Indigenous history, there's been so much wonderful contributions to society from our Indigenous communities, from artists to politicians to writers and poets to judges to lawyers to like everyone from every different type of industry. We have people of the Indigenous community that have influenced society in wonderful ways. You know, like look at Robbie Robinson, for example. He is a singer from the Six Nations and he is well known internationally. Or we have Longboat, one of the original fastest marathon runners that have contributed to the running industry. There's so much contributions that our people have had in history that sometimes we need to pause and just reflect and understand that, because oftentimes we hear, at least in the Indigenous community, we oftentimes hear conversations of, well, Indigenous folks are just the leeches of society. That what really use are they in society, that they just need to go back into the bush and or just die, right? These are comments, these are real comments that people make that, you know, I think all of us can perhaps have experienced some form of racism or harm or disrespect. And when that happens to you, something just comes over you where you maybe at times start to doubt yourself. Maybe at times you start to believe the words that are being spoken of you or of your people. I remember a time where I first came to Toronto and I was walking on one of the streets here. It's a park downtown, Allen Gardens, and it's now known as Tent City. But there was a time about 23 years ago that I was walking down the street and I had come across somebody who I'd known or who I knew at the time. And he was with a white person. And when he introduced me to this person, this non-Indigenous person looked at me and he says, "Oh, so you're a drunk." Right? And I first of all, I don't drink. Let's be clear about that. But that is the perception and the ignorance that many people have of my community, that we are all drunks, that we're all druggies, that we all live on the streets, that we're all homeless, that we're all people who are involved in beating up people and in gangs, that we're all a part of this. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. Every demographic of community out there is guilty of engaging in some form of issues like that, right? But when I looked at this individual, I looked at him and I said, no, first of all, I'm not a drunk, but look at the people around you. Everyone around you are non-Indigenous, who are all on the streets, who are all drunk, struggling with addictions. Take a good look in your own backyard before you start throwing a rock in somebody else's face. The power of your words the power of your actions, you never know what those words and actions may do to someone in that moment that you have that interaction. Fortunately, you know, I'm a pretty strong-willed person. I've been raised to understand and know exactly who I am and where I come from and all the gifts that I've been given and how I've been mentored as a child in my culture. So hearing that didn't really faze me. It was kind of shocking at first, but it didn't really affect me because I knew there was no truth to it, right? I know my truth, and that's all that matters to me. But you know, when we look at, for example, people on the street, I want to just talk about this for a moment. When we see people on the street, oftentimes many of us just continue to walk by. Sometimes people are annoyed by what they see on the street or disgusted, or they just don't want to have no eye contact. It's just best to keep walking forward. But when I see an Indigenous person on the street, it is my spiritual obligation and responsibility to give them a slight nod, to acknowledge them out of respect. I don't know their story. I don't know their history, what resulted in them being on the street, but they are still a spiritual being in a physical form, and they do deserve that respect of acknowledgement, right? A different way of looking at things, right? And even if I see a non-Indigenous person who's homeless, if I don't have change, I'll always look at them in the eye and I'll always acknowledge them. And I say hello or try to have a good day, right? These small little acts of kindness, acknowledgements mean grand to some people, especially those who are already on the street. I mention this because when we look at Indigenous ways of knowing and being, as I mentioned, we're all spiritual beings. And it is my responsibility from spirit to spirit to acknowledge that spirit, right? When I come across an Indigenous person, we have a word in my language called Wewe Nenebuju, which is considered to be one of our original twins. And the short name of Wewe Nenebuju is Bojo. Kind of sounds like French, but it's not. And Wewe Nenebuju, or Bojo, lives in all of us. This is why, from spiritual being to spiritual being, that we must be able to acknowledge the spirit of Wewe Nenebuju that sits within that physical form in front of you by nodding, acknowledging, showing respect. And so that is one way that I celebrate all that is Indigenous by first acknowledging the people at the very lowest of the low that people want to forget. My mother oftentimes reminded me, it's the ones that are on the streets, it's the ones that are in incarcerations, that are in institutions, that society just wants to forget and ignore. But we must do the opposite. Regardless of what harms they've done, regardless of the wrongs that they've done, we must be able to acknowledge them. Right? And so this is what I do, and that's how I celebrate indigeneity and who I am as an Indigenous person, by at least acknowledging person to person, right? We have so many things in Indigenous culture that are so beautiful, right? Most society views anything that deals with any beauty of indigeneity is the teepee, right? They automatically hone in on the teepee. They automatically hone in on powwows. The romanticization of an Indigenous person that is perpetuated by Hollywood, right? They've shifted that now. But before, the whole notion of cowboys and Indians, who was the one that oftentimes got killed or was the villain, was the Indian person. I use Indian in that word because that's the word that they use. Indian to us is not a word that we use, right? Indian refers to people from India, right? Or at least that's our understanding. But this whole notion of the romanticization of Indigenous people want to be able to jump on, so to speak, the bandwagon. One, because it's cool to be Native now, and enjoy the beauty of Indigenous culture that is convenient for them in this moment in time. That might mean powwows. That might be going to a festival. That might be going to an electric powwow. That might be going to a festival of food where there's Indigenous foods. And that's fine and dandy, but we also must be able to acknowledge all the stuff that has brought us to this point. That history, the dark stuff that nobody wants to talk about, that nobody wants to discuss, that nobody wants to care to know. And I think sometimes when we are so caught up on the glamour of what it's like to be Indigenous, the real issues tend to be forgotten or overlooked. And I want to allude to the issue of, and we've heard this time and time again, and a lot of people are saying, quote unquote, I'm sick and tired of hearing the Indians talking about residential school, but guess what? We will be tired of telling our stories on our terms, on our schedule, when we are sick and tired of telling our stories, right? And so it brings me to the issue of residential school. You know, residential school is, when we look at that system, it was intended to, quote unquote, and the policy that Egerton Ryerson created, the grandfather of the education system, in his policy, it quoted to kill the Indian. That was the name of the policy. And this was the development and implementation of residential schools. I come from 4 generations of residential school survivors. My mom, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, it's all we know. This is our reality, is residential school. So if it took us 4 or 5 generations to go through this process of residential school, it's going to take us that much longer to get past it, right? And that's where those stories will continue to be spoken for that length of time. I have a granddaughter, and she's 3 years old, but she may not have anything to do with residential school, but she will learn the truth of residential school from the family's perspective, not from the fantasy perspective of the Canadian education system, because it's not accurate. We lived it. We survived it. Many of my family members did not. And those that did, and those who have passed on those stories, we now have a responsibility to speak those truths and speak about those stories so that people can continue to learn those truths of those systems, right? My mother was like she had recently passed on the end of March, and she was one of 16 children, 14 of which went to residential school. 2 were murdered in residential school, the youngest being 4 years old. Harsh reality, harsh truth. Those realities have impacted, for example, tremendously my grandparents. And I and my mother, when she was alive, was convinced that that was the killing of my grandparents. The loss of their spirit when all their children were taken away. And my grandmother's baby boy, Billy, that was murdered in residential school. That was the beginning of the end for my grandparents. And they never were able to reclaim themselves. They never were able to reclaim themselves. I mean, I can't imagine if somebody took my child away, and I wasn't able to have any control or say in that. And never to see my daughter for such a period of long time, like whether 6 months to a year to a couple of years or whatever. Some residential school survivors never got to see their children for many years. Some got to see them during the holidays for a brief period, and it was a gift to see their kids, not a privilege, if they were of good behavior children. I can't imagine what it would be like for my grandparents to know that all their children were taken away. You know, I share this because I have a responsibility to carry that torch for my family now. Many of them have passed. We have only 4 surviving out of the 16 now. And those stories will go with them to their grave. So it leaves this generation, my generation, the responsibility to speak about this. And I just can't imagine. I just can't imagine how I'm gonna frame it for you so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. Imagine your children the night before having to curl the kids' hairs, the girls' hairs, and the rags. So my grandparents used to curl the hair with the rags, sew all the clothes up, prepare all the children the night before. The children had no clue what was happening. All they know is they were going for a train ride. And having to wake up that next morning, and my grandparents were told to bring the children to the train station or be thrown in jail and charged or killed. And then walking to the train station, knowing that you don't know when you're going to see your children again. And having to tell your children, it will be okay. Not knowing where they're going or how long they're going to be on the train, who's going to go look after them while on the train, if they're going to be fed, how are they going to be okay? And that moment when the children realized, my aunts and uncle realized that they were going on a train ride without their parents. I can't even imagine that. That difficulty, that hurt, and that pain. So as the children leave, the emotions and the feelings that my grandparents must have had when they seen that train disappear in the distance. We had a community of no children. Children were supposed to be heard in the distance playing and laughing, riding the bikes and playing in the puddles and swimming in the lakes and just being kids. But yet you have an entire community of silence. I cannot imagine that. And this is why my grandparents and my uncles and my aunts, great aunts and great uncles, and they all became alcoholics. And they took to the bottle to drown their pains and sorrows because they didn't know when their children were going to come back. And they were forbidden to actually go to the residential school. And we later found out that the residential school was a 9.5-hour train ride in the dark to a remote location, what is now known as, well, there's a community on the highway just before Kenora on Highway 11, I think it's Highway 11, a place called Vermilion Bay. Up Vermilion Bay, up that highway towards a place called Red Lake, up Red Lake Road. That was the residential school site of Macintosh. If you can Google it, Macintosh it's no longer standing. But that's where the territory of the residential school was. And that's where the trains would stop and let the children out. I mention this because I don't want people to walk away today thinking that there is this glorified beauty of why we look at Indigenous Month. I think we need to understand and know that history of pain. Why do we have a generation of Indigenous folks struggling with what they're struggling with in terms of either addictions or homelessness or incarcerations or children in child welfare? We have to understand why that is. What was the reasons behind that led these individuals to live those lives? And that is the intergenerational trauma of that residential school system. You can package it any way you want. That is the reality. And having these conversations educates and teaches people how that history was, the real history of what transpired that has brought us to where we are today. Right? I'm 51 years old. I may not have gone to residential school. I've gone to boarding school, which was another face of residential school. Similar experiences of those in residential school. But that cycle stopped when my daughter was born. And she's 23 years old. And now she has a child of 3 years old, my granddaughter, who will never experience that type of history, that type of experience ever. But to learn and understand the history so she can understand our truths of our family, our truths of our people. Why do we walk on the street and we see these difficulties that are unfolding before us within our Indigenous community? There is a reason behind that. And we have a responsibility to learn that. We have a responsibility to open our mind and not just look at it from this perspective and say, oh, they're just a drunk. Or they're on the street because they're useless and they don't know how to do anything for themselves, right? Most of the people that are on the streets that I know in Toronto are the products of residential school survivors. They're the children of residential school survivors. They're the children who have been taken away from their families, from their parents who are residential school survivors because they were placed in child welfare and then they aged out. This notion, this sense of being disconnected from community, what is community, what is family, is non-existent to some of these individuals. And so they just move to the streets and exist. That's just one example, right? So sharing this is about getting people to understand the story, or that what you see at face value may not be as accurate as you think. And it requires us to take a step back and to ask questions. Just ask questions. I'll tell you what, you were to ask anybody on the street a question, they will be so forthcoming. Most of them would. I asked one of the people I know on the streets. I used to work in the courts, seen them on the street, and I asked this person, tell me, who are you? Tell me, what has brought you to the streets? What has gone on in your life that made you have the choice to decide to be on the street? Tell me a little bit about that. And you know what? The information that flows, the stories that flow, they're such beautiful stories, by the way. Sad stories. They're stories. And so moving forward, when we look at this month, we have a lot to celebrate. We have a lot to reflect on. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of conversations to be had. There is a need for education more than ever before. Like I said in the beginning, it is cool to be Indigenous now. What does that mean? Well, people want to talk about the issues now, right? Allies. Let's be very clear. There is a role and responsibilities to allies, to our community, like any ally in any event or any type of issue that's out there. You have a role, responsibility as an ally, but there are parameters to your role as an ally. It's not your job to speak the stories of those stories of where they come from. You're there to stand in support and be present and listen, right? And so when we look at this month, you'll see and you'll hear a lot of different events at festivals or powwows or performances, people who are dancing in their traditional regalias. You'll hear conversations of history, much like what I had just mentioned. And this is a time where we actually get to share with society our customs and our practices and our belief systems, our dances, our ceremonies, right? There was that time when we couldn't do that. We couldn't dance at powwows. It was considered to be a demonic, satanic worshiping act. And that was illegal, and you were shot, killed, or thrown in jail. Right? Now we get to do this openly and publicly and enjoy that piece of educating the community, educating society. And we've come a long way. We've come a long way. We've got so much more work to do. But when I look at the contributions to our community as a whole, I'm so very proud of our people. Whether you're Anishinaabe, whether you're Mushkego, the Cree of the plains, or of the swampy area of northern Quebec and northern Ontario, whether you're people of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Wendat, the Huron, the Blackfoot, the Sarcee, the Winnebago, then the list goes on. We have such a diversity of our people within our own communities, right across Turtle Island. And for those who don't know what Turtle Island is, that's what we refer to as North America. We have nations of people that are present in every mile of this continent, right? In Canada, we have 666 First Nations in Canada alone. Ironically, that number 666, right? For someone who's non-religious, right? The church systems that try to make us into non-evil devil people worshiping type of society people, uses the number 666 to create 666 First Nations in Canada. I find it so very ironic. Nonetheless, there is a lot happening this month. And so I suppose some of you might be asking the question, well, what can I do? Be present. Ask questions. Engage. Where's that action we spoke about? When somebody speaks about an issue of Indigenous issues and you know that there is no truth to it, you have a responsibility to speak up. You have a responsibility to place action, right? So go to the festivals, engage with the community, enjoy the food, enjoy the music and the performances, be present, right? We want people to feel included. Ironically, when we look at our history, society never included us. But yet here we are, because we are such an embracing community of people, we embrace all. And that's because of the systems and the belief systems that we have in our indigenous belief systems, which is to respect the spirit of women and Abuju that exist in all of us. All right, this is why we're so embracing. This is why we bring in everybody into our spaces, right? I'm going to pause there. I mean, Daddy could speak forever, I'll tell you that much, right? How are we for time, Angela? And what was the other young lady's name or young person's name?
Carla, I was trying to I was giving her a signal to unmute me again. No, we're doing great. We're doing great for time.
Okay.
And as I said to folks, we do have this block till 3:30, knowing that some of you may have only planned for 3 o'clock. But you know, keep going. The one thing that I'd love to jump in with now is that on my own personal journey, one of the things I talk about a lot is about intention. Something I learned really early on. Is that it's you know, why are you doing this? Why are you going here? Why are you mentioned a powwow? And when you talk about somebody going to a powwow, why are you choosing to do that? Is it to learn? Is it to engage? Is it to understand? Or is it to go and just feel better about yourself? And so there's a very different spirit that you can take to something like that. And you know, even myself, when I pronounce things incorrectly, you know, it's as you mentioned, 666 First Nations. We all have different languages, many different languages. There's different words, very, very different cultures, and but it's all about intention, and it's about trying, and it's about leaning in and wanting to understand. And I always say, everybody's going to step in it. I step in it every day, but you know, I don't kick it. I go into it with the right attitude, and I want to learn more even from my own personal journey. And I really appreciated when I learned that lesson, and I try to share that as much as possible. So like I said, we're good for time. So keep telling us more about this fabulous month and what else we could do and engage in. The stories are incredible.
Okay, so let's Angela, thank you for that. So how about go through a few perhaps questions that some people may have, and then we'll see how the questions navigate the rest of the conversation, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I believe that, well, whoever's the moderator.
Yeah, I see most of the comments have been around people mentioning about their own some of their personal journey. Diane, you made a comment here about your own family leaving a residential school. Your grandmother was taken from her family and went to a residential school. Did you have a question as well to go with that, or was that just a comment? You want to unmute yourself? Oh, or Carly, you're going to have to help her unmute, I think.
Is that Deanna?
No, Diane Anderson.
Oh, sorry, Deanna.
Sorry, Deanna. I thought it was Deanna too.
Yeah, we'll grab Deanna in a second. Sorry.
Yeah, just getting Diane.
And while we're waiting, perhaps, you know, those who are still on the call, if you have any questions, ask questions. There's no silly question. You're not going to offend me. Just ask your questions. We're in a very safe space, so let's just have the conversations moving forward. So.
Okay,
I
Diana.
think I'm unmuted now.
There we go.
Hi, it wasn't so much a question. It was just while he was sharing about, you know, people's thoughts on residential school and hoping that people, you know, how people were able to reconnect. It just struck me, so I blotted it in there.
Oh, it was fantastic. I don't know if you got to see it, EJ, but her comment was their great grandmother was taken from her family to a residential school and survived. Once she got married and had children of her own, she put a different nationality on the census every year to avoid losing my grandmother and great aunts in the same way. So as I commented, it's not an unusual story.
You know, that's a very common story.
Common.
Unfortunately, yes. And I've heard so many similar stories of this because a lot of those individuals felt it was safer to identify from another demographic of people or ethnicity because they didn't want their family members to go through the same experience that they did. Sometimes I've heard, I won't mention whom, but you know, how some individuals enrolled in the army, because when you enrolled in the army, you lost your status, and so you just became a member of society. And there's reasons behind that. Or, you know, my mom was one of them where she wanted to protect, I believe, she didn't say it in so many words, but her actions kind of alluded to that she wanted to protect her children from those experiences that she had. So she married a non-native person so that, you know, and then she lost her status and she became a quote unquote a white woman because she married a non-native man. But then in 1985 reinstated her status, becoming back to a native woman, which is so bizarre. But point being is that Diane, that story, those experiences are very common. And we're hearing a lot of people nowadays reclaiming their identities and their rightful places in communities through applications perhaps of status, or first of all, let me be very clear. Status does not define whether or not you are an Indigenous person or not, right? It is the government's way of that. But from within our Indigenous circles, we don't base a person greater Indigenous or lesser than because you are status or non-status. And those who don't know what status is, it's the recognition that the federal government issues, quote unquote, an Indian to be a registered Indian in the country of Canada. So, but we're seeing a lot of folks that now are reclaiming their identities and recognizing that there is history there and there's reasons why that their grandparents or great grandparents did what they did. And people are now trying to make connections to community. When I say community, I'm talking about their traditional territories, their traditional First Nations that they may or could have been affiliated with. And then it's a journey, and it's very complicated. So I won't get into the whole notion of pretend Indian, but the pretend Indian movement is another form of colonization that has made its way into our communities. That is affecting our Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and how our community is made up. So, but that's maybe that's a conversation we could talk about another time.
We'll have to schedule another call.
That's a hot one.
It's a very hot one. And, into
Yes.
some of the things that you've commented on, I mentioned last year when we were kicking off this month, that my own grandfather gave up his status to go to war, fight in World War II for this country. And you couldn't be Indigenous and a person at the same time. So he had to make a choice to be a person and to go to war and fight for Canada, and gave up his status and never regained his status. And and I'm on my own journey of learning what it means to be Mohawk of the Bay of Quinte, and learning lots about my own family and culture. And it's hard to believe that it was you weren't considered a person. That's the part that just blows my mind. And then now with the status card, that the other part that blows my mind whenever I talk about status with people is it has an expiry date. And that really sits in my craw, that you gain status, you're given a card, and it has an expiry date. It's not like it's a health card. It's not like it's a credit card. This is actually identifying you as a First Nations person in Canada, but it has an expiry date. And it's just so
mind-boggling.
Bizarre to me. So bizarre. But we do have a couple other questions. We do have Deanna. I see you've got your hand up, and I've seen lots of things that you've put in the chat here. So if we want to, Carla, unmute Deanna and see if what your question is there. Your father, yes, you mentioned in the chat here about your father, and your father passed away this morning? No, he died of a heart attack at 5 a.m. on a day. I saw that you wrote in the chat. And then you also mentioned in the chat that somebody they hit you on the sidewalk and you felt hurt inside. And was that about you being Indigenous? Oh, that's very, very sad. Similar to what you were talking about EJ, with the not acknowledging or acknowledging with violence.
Yeah, it happens far too often.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is mean. It's very mean. You're absolutely right. Very mean. And you were saying that he in the chat that and you're learning more about your dad's history from where he was living, and you're learning about those relationships. That's absolutely amazing. If there's anything more that you want to share with us, Deanna, don't hesitate to. I know you were both private messaging me and putting some stuff in the chat, but my deepest sympathies on the loss of your. Absolutely. You're very welcome. Very welcome.
So
All right. Go ahead, DJ.
I think is Xavier.
Yeah.
Javier.
I think Carla has to. Oh, there you go.
Hello, everyone. I'm on mute now.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. My name is Javier, and I'm currently SW at Fairview Home. And I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you so much for this meaningful discussion, especially to EJ. I just keep reading on the 21 things you might not know about the Indian Act, a very powerful book written by Bob Joseph. I read it twice, and I'm going to read it. But again, yes, our speaker is pretty much, I'll say 100% correct when you say there's a lot of things to celebrate. And one of that is the continuous struggle of the indigenous communities globally. So I'm from the Philippines, and I'm I'm international student here. And I would like to say sorry because I was not aware about the conditions of the indigenous communities here in Canada when I'm still in the Philippines. And when I came here, that's the only time I found that it's horrible. But the struggle, the hope is still there. So the continuous struggle of indigenous people of Canada and the Philippines and the rest of the world are interconnected. I can feel every one of you because I'm a human rights advocate and an activist back in the Philippines. I've seen friends who was killed, friends who are still languishing in jail right now. I'm still connected with the organization back home because of the so-called developmental project. They are protecting their land, from big mega dams, from mining corporations, and sad to say, multi-billion corporations are from. Some of them are from Canada, and the government of the Philippines impose, for example, this, the anti-terrorism law to combat what they called opposing for the development project, quote unquote. And also I learned from being an advocate of being with the indigenous people struggle is that spiritual being is being destroyed by profit motives, or I'll just say the monopoly capitalist corporations in general. So in the here we discuss about the Indian Act, residential schools, and the 60s scope. But as I've said, the struggle is still ongoing. So my question, or probably how from your point of view, I would like to take it on the structural in general. So for EJ, how does, from your point of view, how does the economic policies affect the lives of the indigenous communities in general? Because in my country, they're being oppressed. CANSEC, I don't know if you're familiar about CANSEC, is Canada Security, and Canadian armaments are being supplied in the Philippines, not to defend the Filipino communities, especially indigenous communities, but they use it to red tag, to massacre, kill people, indigenous leaders, indigenous people, so that they can easily taken away from the lands where the indigenous communities located are very much rich in natural resources. So in Canada, I think based from what I read is the indigenous people or communities, they in general receive less emphasis on social services. So you see the commonalities there. So yeah, that's my question. How do you think, from your point of view, how does the economic policies right now affect the lives of the indigenous people?
Good
Thank you.
question, a complicated question. And it can't be responded in a way that is a blanket approach to all of our First Nations across Canada, because depending on where one resides, whatever geographical region they come from, resources will vary from region to region. So for example, those Indigenous folks, say in Alberta, that have access to the oil fields, and those resources there will definitely differ from those resources, say, in my First Nation, which is the main industry in my community is forestry, but there's no more wood anymore. There's no more trees anymore. However, my First Nation is a part of what they refer to as the 8th Ring of Fire. And we all know what Ring of Fire is in terms of the mining industry and whatnot in Northern Ontario. So, and in terms of the resources and the extraction of resources, I'm just going to say it the way it is. It's not a fair dynamic. Obviously, corporate, and obviously all the companies that come into these spaces and extract resources, they're there to make a profit. And in the process, will eliminate and or remove those that are in the way. Let's be clear. The Mining Act of Canada supersedes all federal laws by the federal government. It is the oldest act that we have in Canada. Even the federal government can't even get past the legislation with the Mining Act. This is how powerful that act is. And so when that act and all the companies come in to extract resources, say in a First Nation, my First Nation, we've discovered that there are gold and diamond, and there's a third mineral, main arteries in our traditional territory. Our traditional territory has been relocated 3 times because of Ontario Hydro and the flooding of our territory and the flooding of our burial grounds. And so our First Nation, to where it is located now, is moved 3 times. Now we've reclaimed our traditional old territory where our old burials were on the northwest region of Lake Nipigon. Beautiful territory. But now there's a discovery of these 3 main arteries of minerals. Now, is it safe to say that the Mining Act of Canada is going to come in once again to relocate us for a 4th time and claim stake to that territory? Or are our people going to stand up? Right? This is what we're facing right now. So to answer your question, it appears that Indigenous folks tend to get I hate to say it, are the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak, when it comes to accessing those resources and benefiting from those resources that are extracted from the traditional territories, because other corporations that come in get priority. So we lose out. My community is the highest rate in Canada for cancer. It was on the news before. The town of Armstrong and White Sand are the highest rate of cancer in Canada. Why? Because the PCB barrels that were left behind by the federal army were buried in the watersheds, made its way and seeped into our water fields and contaminated the entire soil. So why we are not allowed to disrupt the soil because of the contaminants from PCP. So I hope that answers your question. And the only way that that's ever going to change is if we actually have people in our AFN, the Assembly of First Nation, our federal bodies, and I'll probably get my hand slapped for this because it's recorded, who are really the puppets of the federal government. So the federal government goes to our AFN and puts a pitch for whatever and gets the endorsements and all the BCR council endorsements, the ban resolutions, make it into law to do what they want, because there's always kickbacks. There's always kickbacks. People in power always have kickbacks, right? Our First Nation leadership is no different, right? So when I say they are the puppets for the federal government, at our federal body of governing bodies that represents our communities, not effective. We have to change leadership. We have to change the models, and we need to dismantle the AFN so that the federal government does not have any say into how business is done in our communities. But that's another political conversation. Too heavy for today's topic, but point being is that to answer that question, it's very complicated. There's like multiple streams that can be discussed to answer that question. And I kind of just dabbled in 3 of them, right?
So now you've set us up for 2 other talks extensively. Absolutely, but to your point where you talk about some of the corruption, similar to what you were saying before about the destitution and the angst and the hurt that drove family members to a life of alcohol and addictions. Some of these things that we see have happened in these communities have led people to a lot of anger, angst, mistrust, and then you get into different positions, and it's when a history is performed the way that it has in the past, there's a belief that it can happen again, and lots of histories around the world have proven that. And so a lot of folks, when they do get into certain positions, it does kind of become every person for themselves, and unfortunately, as you said, it can lead to corruption and a thought of taking care of yourself versus what maybe is best for the whole group. It's hard to look at these things and not rationalize people's behavior and see that it's diluting, as you said, diluting the effectiveness of all of our nations.
It's these issues we're talking about are so much more complicated than what we're talking about right now. We don't have the time to discuss these issues in detail. All we're able to do today is just kind of dabble in some of the conversations and kind of, give you some of those seeds to think about. But when we look at, again, bringing it back to the reason why we're here today is to talk about, and there was is that a bee or a fly or what?
It's a bee.
I saw that.
Sorry.
That's good luck, by the way. That is very good luck, by the way.
Oh, I'll take your word for it.
But the reason why we're here today is to talk about Indigenous Month and the celebration of, Indigenous Day, for example, and all that is. These are those conversations that we're having today that have brought us to where we are today. These are the conversations that need to be spoken. Many of society have no clue of what we're talking about today. Or if they do, they know only at the surface bit about it. It's far more layering than what I'm speaking about. I'm not the expert, for example. I'm going to be very clear. I'm not the expert to talk about all that is Indigenous issues that affect our communities, but I can speak about my own experiences and my own lived experiences and my own experiences of my people from my territory. That's the perspective that I could speak from. And so, I don't have all the answers for the issues that are happening of the day. But, the bulk of what we talk about in today's present context of Indigenous issues relates to the legacy of the residential school, right? Mm-hmm. Moving forward, more recently, it speaks to the issue of the Child Welfare Act. It talks about the institutions. It talks about the 60s scoop. These are recent, relatively recent issues in history that we are dealing with today in terms of our community members, right? So that's the context that I can give you. I mean, I could talk about the history in terms of when policy and all this sort of stuff was created back in 1710 and 1846 and 1848 and implementation 1850 and moving forward. I could talk about that. Grab your popcorn because we'll be in for a long conversation, right?
Absolutely.
Because it gets quite juicy and quite depressing.
Mhm,
That's history,
mhm.
right? That has brought us here today to celebrate the indigeneity that we are today. I mean, we couldn't speak our language in public. Now we can go to a professional performance and speak my language openly to give a convocation or to give words of encouragement to the community in my language. We could not do that, right? That shows and that speaks to how we are moving forward and we are progressing. So there needs to be acknowledgement of that. And I'm so grateful for that because that is the work that I do. And this has brought me to the day, this has brought me to you guys today to speak about these issues, right? And so it just speaks to how we have so much work to do though, moving forward though. We really have so much more work to do. What they teach in the education system, I have to keep my language very, very professional.
PG-14.
Right? Yes. It is not truth. It is not truth. And the reason why that is because the federal government and the education system wants to hide the truth. When we start speaking of truth, it makes people feel uncomfortable at times. In order for us to understand and learn and to grow and appreciate and move forward, we have to become a little uncomfortable in our norms. We have to feel it. We have to be in it, right? That's the only way I think that people can really, truly, truly appreciate and understand what I'm speaking about. And it doesn't just relate to indigenous issues. Today is the kickoff of LGBT Pride Month. The uncomfortableness of that conversation that people have has to be had in order for us to learn to move forward, to understand the atrocities and the histories and the inequalities that exist in that issue of topic, right? Every one of us come from some kind of community that has had some type of atrocity or trauma or disrupt. And we have to speak about those in order for us to learn those truths and those histories, for us to appreciate and learn and understand the person that we are engaging with.
And to see the intersection between a number, as you mentioned, it's the kickoff of Pride Month, and the number of folks we know of the two-spirited, who some of the Indigenous communities were very welcoming and some were not.
Some were not. I mean, in my community, if I ever disclosed that I was gay in my community, I had a bat coming after me. Many of my friends were killed because they were gay in First Nation communities, right? So we have to be very careful of how we blanket approach conversations, that it relates to all of us when it doesn't. Indigenous issues, the medicine wheel modality doesn't relate to all of us, right? We don't all follow the medicine wheel. We all don't go powwow dancing. We all don't practice ceremony, right? We all don't practice the smudge or have the feather. So we just have to just put the halters on for a moment, step back, have simple conversations, and ask the questions. You know, if you're going to ask any questions, right, now is the time to do it during this month, because everybody is so embracing and just all lovey-dovey and wants to just offer the information because it's cool to be Native now, especially during this month. But ignorance is always there.
For sure.
Ignorance and prejudice is always going to be there. The key is how we're going to address it and respond to it.
Absolutely.
right?
We do have a question actually that's very related to this. Is Brad Dowdle has asked in the chat, do you think the Métis Nation should be recognized federally instead of only provincially? And I will admit to not knowing that the Métis Nation wasn't recognized federally until you put that in the chat, Brad. So thank you for asking the question. And EJ, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, again, a loaded question.
Choose to decline.
No, again, these are those conversations that we need to have. I am of mixed heritage. I am of Ojibwe and French, so technically, biologically, I am Métis. But I was registered at a time that gave me full status recognition of being registered, quote unquote, an Indian. I know that I am Métis. I know my truth. I don't need the status card to tell me that I am Métis or full status. But to answer your question, that is a very, it's a very complicated question because there is understanding that in order to use the term Métis, you have to have connection to the settlements of specific regions in Manitoba and Saskatchewan that relate to Louis Riel. Okay, so let me just leave that there for a moment.
Yep.
When we look at the term Métis, by its original intention of what that was defined as, it was an Ojibwe man that had children. No, I'm sorry. It was an Ojibwe and a Ojibwe woman that had a child with a French man. Hence the term Métis. Nowadays, moving forward, the use of that word is any Native person with any white person is considered Métis. Now, if we use that example by its now definition and how it's used, would not align with the original definition that is used in Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
Right.
And those territories and those societies of people would not acknowledge those people as being Métis. So to go and answer the question on whether it needs to be registered or rather recognized federally, I'm on the fence with that, to be honest, only because I am of the thought in agreement of the definition of Métis that have connection to its original territory of Saskatchewan and Manitoba.
It almost seems a disservice to their cultural heritage.
It is, and the Michif language and its original dialect comes from that settlement territory.
Wow.
Now anybody can learn language.
Yep. I didn't know any of this today.
Right?
Thank you
Anybody
for-
can learn language, but what makes it so complicated is, for example, if we use the province of Quebec, Quebec is the only province in Canada that does not have any number treaty. I come from 1850, Treaty 6, Treaty 9, Treaty 1, Treaty 8, all these different number treaties that exist across Canada, but Quebec is the only province that does not have treaties. No, let me correct. Does not have a number treaty. They do have the Friendship Treaty that was signed between France and Britain, acknowledging that French people in Quebec were a distinct society of people. But when that treaty was created, it disregarded the original inhabitants of Indigenous people. They were not at the table for that conversation. And so then you bring in the conversation about status, then you bring in the conversation about Métis, and its recognition don't exist.
Wow. Very interesting. Wow.
So again, to answer the question, should it be recognized perhaps? My thoughts on recognition of a national level. I'd like to say yes.
But you don't know.
Understanding the intricacies, the complications of the original definition in settlements, I would be more inclined to say no. And that it needs to be regional based on that connection to those people, that distinct society of people in Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, for giving us such a compelling topic. I think it could be a whole other talk as well. I'd love
That's
to
all.
have some folks who are of Métis background to come on a call and have some great conversation about this. There's one other comment in the chat which I think is quite interesting. It's from Brittany, who gave the land acknowledgement today. Hopefully, you're still on the call, Brittany, and asking about how to start your journey if somebody has mentioned to you within the family that you may be Indigenous, or you may have some Indigenous connection. And I will say that for myself, just to share personally, I mean, I knew quite closely, very clearly where I was from and where the family was, but I lacked confidence in my history and my heritage, although it was literally like right there. Like my people were right there. And I knew many of them, but part of what I did, being somebody who maybe a bit of a doubting Thomas in lots of ways, is I reached out to the local library. It was recommended to me on Tyndinaga, and actually got on some ancestry calls. And my first call, I've shared with a number of people, my first call, I said, oh, my grandfather and blah, blah, blah. And, but I'm pretty confident that his mom was actually not Indigenous. And maybe that's where this all, and they were just like, what are you talking about? And then I just this stream of information from all of these knowledge keepers who shared with me, and we're talking about my family. They're like, I know your aunt, I know your uncle, I know these people, and inspired me then to go down tracing my family tree. And it's been there's lots of heartache as I go through the tree. There's lots of sadness that I didn't have the conversations with my grandfather before he passed away. But it's also been an incredible, beautiful journey. Just seeing, it's like every time I look into it, it's like more pages in a book open up, and the book is endless. And it's been a beautiful journey for me. And I don't know, EJ, if you have any other recommendations for someone.
Well, you know what? Everyone's experience and journey will differ, and that will require a different approach each time. You use the library, and look where it brought you, right? Some people may use, ironically, the archives within the Catholic Church, the baptismals, and all the records in churches. I will say they kept phenomenal records.
Yes.
Maybe 2 good records.
Baptismal certificates, etc.
Right. So there's that avenue. So any of the religious orders do have really great, I hate to say that, but great archives in terms of recording. And just, having general conversation in public and putting yourself out there. And I remember you and I were having a conversation in the beginning when we first had our very first contact. You were going to use the word ally, and I cautioned you not to do that.
I actually had enrolled in a course.
Yeah. And the reason why I cautioned you not to use the word ally is because then when you discover that you were, then it'll bring us into the conversation. Well, then she's just a reborn Indian, and maybe she's a pretend Indian, and she sees opportunities for advancement in career. And that's why she's identifying as such. And I told you, no, you will say that you have identity to the Indigenous community, and you're on a journey of discovering that. Right? And leave it at that.
Absolutely.
And then again, at the end of the day, you don't have to justify yourself to anybody in terms of your journey.
Absolutely.
Right? But that boils down to your own comfort level, right? Being present in ceremony, or being present in ceremonial spaces or sacred spaces or sharing circles or community, whatever that might be, whatever that might look like, just make yourself present and have conversation with people. Making connections. One person had messaged me years ago. I was working on my First Nation as the Ontario Works administrator, and I got a call from somebody from Ottawa, and she said, I'm trying to make connections to my family, and I was told that it might be from White Sand, which is my community. So she gave me some bits and pieces of information. I said, let me have a conversation with my aunties and my uncles and my mom and my cousins. Let's see what they come up with, the older folks. And to our surprise, we found history like she was not expecting. And we were able to connect her with her biological mother. She ended up being a product of rape, hence why she was delivered in Montreal at one of those religious sanatoriums, I think it was. I think that's what they call them, sanatoriums. Montreal is known for that. And she was adopted out to a loving family, a non-Indigenous family. But she wanted to make connection because she realized that she had darker skin than from her siblings. And so she obviously did not belong traditionally to that family. So she made connections and made those inquiries. Ended up being that she met her mother, and she found out that her mother made she asked me to make a promise to her that I would never disclose to her daughter until she passed away that she was a product of rape. And so I held on to that information until she passed. Point being, though, is that there is power. There is power in community. There is so much power in the knowledge that exists in community. She did not know who I was from a hole in the ground. And yet the power of community and the knowledge that exists within our community of all those residential school survivors came forward, and they were able to connect the dots, connect this woman to her biological mother before her biological mother passed.
Oh, that's amazing. What a
Right?
wonderful.
So just having conversations with people in community can lead you to a discovery of something that you never expected.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, when you mentioned about the documentation, one of the things that I discovered is the how bad people were at spelling. So a lot of the documentation for my grandfather is and the miscommunication on Indigenous Veterans Day. Last year, the Mohawks of Bay of Quinte posted this beautiful post, and it came in my feed, and I looked and I went, oh my goodness, there's my grandfather with the wrong name. And I wrote back to them and said, hey, we need to connect because some documents need to be updated. And there's a whole series of misspellings when they would do census, somebody walking up and knocking on someone's door. So it can be incredibly challenging to find accurate documentation. And like you said, the churches, military records are sometimes the best places for official stuff. But the knowledge keepers in the communities, like you said, just having conversations, and it's been an incredible journey for me in that regard.
Well, just to add before we finish up here and go to the question is that look at my last name, for example. My last name is pronounced Kwandibens, but the Indian agents of Indian and Northern Affairs of Canada at the time is what they used to call them, INAC, felt our last names were too long. So it was very common for our last names to be chopped down to a shorter variation of the name. So my original last name is pronounced Kwandibens, which is descriptive of a type of bird, a woodpecker type of bird, which is large in the family of the whiskey jack family.
Oh, cool.
Very large bird. But when they saw our names, they chopped it down to Kwandibens, which doesn't have the true meaning of that bird's description, right? So point is that even in INAC, or Indian and Northern Affairs, their documentations may not be as accurate either. So right off the top, a lot of folks who discovered that they're Indigenous, they go to the archives, they go to Ottawa, they go to Gatineau, they contact Indian Affairs, and they go through the paperwork, and they find nothing. And that's partly because a lot of, one, the registrations were not done accurately, or the names were purposely changed, and it was hard to navigate. But another good point is, one final point is, the Archives of Canada in Ottawa have a phenomenal registry. They never refer to people's names. They refer to them as ticket numbers. This is how my mother was able to find generations before her, before my great-grandmother, because they were identified as ticket number 1, ticket number 10, whatever, and they were this and that, whatever, and they belonged to this family. And so the Archives of Canada also is another way of accessing information. But yeah,
Wow.
There's a lot of information. But again, bringing us back to the point of celebrating Indigenous Month, as we draw today's session to a close, there is a lot of history. There is a lot of history that we, in this call, we spoke about, that many people in society have no clue of. But it's learning those histories, again, making us feel perhaps a little uncomfortable, but it's learning those histories. And once you learn the histories, whether it's good or bad, you get a sense of a greater appreciation, perhaps, of where you originate from, or where you come from, or the people that you are from, the language and the customs and the practices. And so that is a starting point of one's identity. What we struggle with in today's society in terms of Indigenous, within our Indigenous circles, is the struggle of identity, or the lack of identity. And so that is always the starting point when we look at people who are trying to rediscover themselves, is to identify their connection to community and learn their identity. And there are many different ceremonial practices and spaces that we have that help foster that. And then now it brings us to the celebration of, right? It's really more about the celebration of the self and what that all means and what does that look like. Yeah, I am a father. I'm an Indigenous father from Northern Ontario, from Wabidanga First Nation. I'm Anishinaabe. I speak my language. I am a powwow dancer. I'm a ceremonial person. I'm a knowledge carrier. See how that layering starts to happen now. So when we look at Indigenous Month, it is a celebration of me as an Indigenous person, not the romanticization of indigeneity. And there's the difference, right? So, Daddy can talk.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the number of people who stuck in there till 3:35. I'm really impressed. I hope that it was as interesting and as educational as it was for me, for each of you. And I hope that you all have some great plans to reach out into the community and get to know all of your Indigenous neighbors, because I promise you they're all there. And we have another call coming up on the 15th. And then again, EJ, you're back on the 29th. So for those of you who have any burning questions or have some experiences you want to share, you'll have a chance to talk about them then. So thank you, everyone.
Food for thought before you go.
Okay.
There is 93,000 Indigenous folks in the city and Greater Toronto area.
They are your neighbors. Absolutely.
Neighbor.
Wonderful.
So
All right. Now Agoa.
Mamapi.